You wake up every day wearing a version of yourself that was built by rejection, silence, and quiet humiliation. You learned early that being real was dangerous, so you became controlled, filtered, small. You watched people walk past your pain without seeing it, and slowly you accepted the lie that you were invisible, not because you were weak, but because you were trained to be. Every ignored message, every forced smile, every moment of swallowed anger rewired your nervous system to tolerate disrespect. You became calm, not because you were strong, but because reacting once taught you the cost. Now you carry storms behind a still face. You analyze rooms before entering. You measure every word. You calculate every move. You live in constant psychological defense mode, trapped between wanting connection and fearing exposure. And the cruel truth is this: people don't prey on weakness, they prey on predictability. They sense who will stay quiet, who will explain themselves, who will endure. They don't hate you, they study you. They test limits. They collect emotional leverage. And every time you stay silent, you teach them exactly how far they can go. This is not about confidence. This is about power. And power is never given. It is taken, slowly, psychologically, and without mercy. You don't notice it happening at first, because identity never shatters in a single moment. It erodes, silently, patiently, like stone dissolving in dark water. And one day you wake up inside a body that still moves, still speaks, still performs, but no longer feels like yours, because the version of you that once had edges, instincts, and dangerous thoughts was slowly dissolved by small humiliations, quiet compromises, and invisible losses that nobody else saw or cared to remember. And the most terrifying part is not that you changed, but that you adapted, because adaptation feels like survival. Yet survival in a hostile psychological environment always requires one thing: self-betrayal, and so piece by piece, your raw self was dismantled, not by enemies, but by expectations, by fear of rejection, by the constant pressure to fit into systems designed to reward obedience and punish deviation, until your personality became a controlled mask, carefully engineered to avoid conflict, avoid judgment, avoid danger. And in that avoidance you unknowingly began the slow execution of your original self, the one that questioned, resisted, desired, and dared. You were not born small. You were not born cautious. You were not born emotionally muted. You were sculpted into this shape through repetition, through emotional conditioning, through reward and punishment loops so subtle that you mistook them for normal life. And every time you swallowed anger, every time you tolerated disrespect, every time you betrayed your own instincts to keep the peace, the old identity weakened, and the new one gained strength, until the real you became a distant memory, a shadow that only appears late at night when the noise dies and the loneliness becomes loud enough to hear. This is how identity is destroyed, not through trauma alone, but through adaptation to chronic discomfort, because when pain becomes predictable, the mind chooses numbness, and numbness slowly becomes personality. You begin to operate, not as a being driven by internal will, but as a system responding to external pressures. And once this shift happens, power no longer belongs to you, it belongs to whoever controls the environment you depend on. This is why most people feel lost without knowing why, exhausted without understanding the source, anxious without clear danger, because they are carrying an identity that is not theirs, built from survival responses, social conditioning, and invisible compromises stacked over years. You learn to speak in ways that minimize reaction. You learn to move in ways that avoid attention. You learn to think in ways that reduce internal conflict. And in doing so, you become psychologically predictable, emotionally manageable, socially safe, and existentially hollow. The world does not need to crush you when it can simply reshape you, because a reshaped mind enforces its own prison. And once this process completes, something strange happens. You stop feeling pain sharply, but you also stop feeling desire deeply. You stop hating, but you also stop loving intensely. You become balanced, stable, neutral, and dead inside, yet functional enough to survive, which is the most efficient form of control, because it produces individuals who obey without resistance and suffer without complaint. This is not weakness. This is training, and it begins in childhood, accelerates in adolescence, and locks in during adulthood, when responsibility replaces curiosity and safety replaces hunger. The system does not demand that you surrender your identity. It simply rewards you every time you betray it, until betrayal becomes habit, and habit becomes character. This is why people defend their psychological cages so fiercely, because those cages are built from their own decisions, and to question them would require confronting the unbearable truth that much of their life was spent becoming something they never consciously chose. And so they cling to routines, labels, and roles, because identity, even a false one, feels safer than uncertainty. But beneath this safety is a quiet terror, the sense that something essential has been lost and may never return. That terror expresses itself as chronic dissatisfaction, as low-grade anxiety, as emotional flatness, as restless ambition without direction, as the constant urge to distract, consume, and escape. People mistake this for modern stress, for burnout, for depression, but it is deeper. It is existential suffocation. It is the mind mourning the death of its own untamed nature. And because this grief has no language, no ritual, no social permission, it turns inward, manifesting as self-criticism, isolation, and silent despair. This is why people feel alone even in crowds, why connection feels shallow, why achievements feel empty, why pleasure fades quickly. They are living from a borrowed identity, and borrowed identities cannot generate authentic meaning. Yet this destruction is not accidental. Systems of power have always understood that controlling identity is more efficient than controlling behavior. If you shape how a person sees themselves, you never need to command their actions. They will police their own thoughts. They will censor their own desires. They will sabotage their own potential. And they will call it maturity. They will call it responsibility. They will call it realism. But realism, in this context, is simply the acceptance of limitation as truth. Nietzsche saw this when he wrote about slave morality, about how societies condition individuals to glorify humility, obedience, and restraint, not because these traits are noble, but because they are useful for maintaining order. Machiavelli understood it when he observed that the most reliable control is achieved not through fear alone, but through psychological dependency. Stoic philosophy warned about it by teaching mastery of the self, because without it, the self becomes a tool of external forces. Across history, the pattern repeats. Identity is the battlefield, and most people never realize they are at war. They believe their thoughts are their own. They believe their values are chosen. They believe their limitations are natural. And so they remain trapped inside a narrative written by others, acting out roles assigned by invisible authors, mistaking conformity for character. The tragedy is not that they suffer. It is that they adapt to suffering so completely that they forget another way of being ever existed. But destruction always precedes transformation. In alchemy, the first stage is dissolution, the breaking down of existing form so that something new can be created. Psychologically, this means the collapse of old identity structures, the painful confrontation with emptiness, the terrifying recognition that the person you have been is no longer viable. This is the stage most avoid at all costs, because it feels like death, and in a way, it is. The old self must die. The beliefs that kept you safe must be burned. The behaviors that maintained acceptance must be stripped away. The emotional armor that protected you must be shattered, and in that raw exposure, something dangerous emerges. Awareness. Awareness of how deeply you have been shaped. Awareness of how carefully you have been managed. Awareness of how much potential was buried under compliance. This awareness is not comforting. It is brutal. It produces rage, grief, and disorientation. You feel betrayed by your past decisions, by your environment, by the systems you trusted. You feel foolish for having believed the promises of safety and belonging. You feel naked in a world that rewards armor. And this is where most retreat, crawling back into familiar patterns, because psychological freedom demands something most are unwilling to pay: the loss of social approval, emotional certainty, and comfortable identity. To rebuild, you must first stand in the ruins, without rushing to decorate them. You must tolerate the void, the silence, the absence of structure. You must learn to exist without labels, without validation, without scripts. And in that silence, your nervous system begins to recalibrate. You start to sense instincts that were long suppressed. You begin to feel anger without guilt, desire without shame, ambition without apology. Your perception sharpens. Your tolerance for nonsense drops. Your emotional reactions slow, not because you are numb, but because you are no longer easily manipulated. This is the rebirth of identity, but it does not feel heroic. It feels isolating. It feels alien. It feels like stepping outside the human herd and realizing how much of social reality is built on unspoken agreements to remain asleep. You see the patterns in conversations. You recognize the power games in relationships. You detect the emotional leverage hidden beneath politeness. You sense the fear driving conformity. And once you see this, you cannot unsee it. The world becomes transparent, but colder, clearer, but lonelier. This is the cost of psychological awakening. You trade belonging for understanding. You trade comfort for clarity. You trade approval for autonomy. And in this exchange, a new identity begins to form, not from reaction, but from intention, not from fear, but from will, not from conditioning, but from conscious selection. This identity is quieter, but heavier, calmer, but more dangerous, detached, but deeply aware. It does not seek attention, because it no longer needs validation. It does not chase power, because it understands how power actually operates. It does not fear isolation, because it knows solitude is the training ground of mastery. And yet, this transformation is never complete. The old patterns constantly attempt to reclaim territory. The social world relentlessly pressures you to return to familiarity. The mind itself resists permanent change, because certainty, even painful certainty, feels safer than the unknown. And so the battle continues, not externally, but internally, between the comfort of who you were and the potential of who you could become. This is where true power is forged, in the daily, invisible refusal to regress, in the silent discipline of self-observation, in the relentless dismantling of unconscious habits, in the deliberate construction of a self that does not beg, does not explain, does not shrink. Most will never reach this stage. They will sense the void, feel the discomfort, and immediately anesthetize it with distraction, entertainment, substances, relationships, and ambition. They will build identities from noise to avoid the silence where truth waits. But a few will remain. A few will endure the psychological winter. A few will allow the old self to fully decay so that something stronger can emerge from the ashes. And when that emergence begins, it is subtle, almost imperceptible, marked not by external success, but by internal stillness, by emotional neutrality, by a strange calm in the face of chaos. This is the moment when you realize that the destruction of identity was never the end. It was the necessary precondition for something far more unsettling, the birth of a self that no longer needs the world's permission to exist. And as this new awareness takes root, you begin to sense a deeper truth forming beneath the surface, a truth about power, control, and human behavior that threatens to dismantle every remaining illusion you still cling to, a truth that, once fully seen, will make it impossible to return to the life you once called normal. And this is where the real descent begins. Silence is never neutral, even when it pretends to be, even when it disguises itself as patience, maturity, or emotional control, because in the psychology of power, silence is read not as restraint, but as consent, not as calm, but as surrender. And the moment you choose not to respond, not to resist, not to assert, you begin teaching the world exactly how to treat you, shaping your position in every hierarchy without ever speaking a word. Because human beings are wired to probe, to test, to push, to measure boundaries in order to locate dominance and vulnerability, and silence becomes the softest boundary of all, easily crossed, easily ignored, easily exploited. The first time someone disrespects you, they are not attacking you, they are studying you, watching how your nervous system reacts, how your posture changes, how your voice adjusts, how your eyes move, and if you remain silent, not calm, but silent, you signal something far deeper than tolerance. You signal accessibility, and accessibility in power dynamics is the invitation to escalation. It tells them that your emotional territory is open, unguarded, and available for occupation. This is why toxic personalities do not immediately dominate. They advance slowly, incrementally, with micro-violations, small intrusions, subtle dismissals, slight humiliations, all designed to test the structural integrity of your psychological boundaries. And every time you remain silent, they receive confirmation that the structure is weak. This is not cruelty. This is instinct. Predators in nature do not attack at full force first. They probe. They observe. They wait for the signal of vulnerability. And in human society, silence is that signal. It tells the aggressive mind that there is no immediate consequence, no retaliation, no resistance, and where there is no resistance, there is opportunity. This is the unspoken law of social physics. Force travels where it is least opposed. And so, those who remain silent become gravitational wells for domination, absorbing disrespect, absorbing emotional labor, absorbing psychological burden, until their internal world collapses under the weight of unexpressed tension. Yet society teaches silence as virtue. It romanticizes restraint. It praises patience. It rewards compliance. It frames emotional suppression as intelligence and conflict avoidance as wisdom. But beneath this moral packaging lies a brutal reality. The world does not respect quiet suffering, it consumes it. It does not honor endurance, it exploits it. And the more you tolerate, the more you normalize mistreatment, the more you teach others that your discomfort is irrelevant. Over time, this becomes identity. You begin to see yourself as the one who absorbs, who understands, who forgives, who adapts. You internalize the role of emotional buffer, the shock absorber of other people's chaos. And because this role is socially rewarded, you confuse it with strength. But strength that never expresses itself externally becomes weakness in every external structure. The mind may feel superior, but the world reads submission. This is why the kindest, most empathetic, most introspective individuals often suffer the most in social environments. Their silence is misread as compliance, their understanding as permission, their patience as tolerance for abuse. And slowly, without noticing, they become psychological dumping grounds, containers for other people's insecurities, frustrations, and unmet desires. The more they carry, the less space remains for their own will, until their inner world becomes crowded with emotions that do not belong to them. This produces chronic fatigue, emotional numbness, and deep resentment that has nowhere to go. But even this resentment is swallowed, because expressing it would break the identity they have built, the identity of calm, of reason, of stability. and so the cycle deepens. Silence leads to tolerance. Tolerance leads to normalization. Normalization leads to identity. And identity, once formed, resists change more fiercely than any external force. The body adapts to this pattern. The nervous system recalibrates. The baseline shifts. Discomfort becomes familiar. Tension becomes background noise. Emotional intrusion becomes daily weather. You stop noticing the storm because you have learned to live inside it. This is how psychological prisons operate. They do not require bars. They require habits. And silence is the habit that builds the walls. Machiavelli understood that people reveal their strength not through words, but through reactions. Nietzsche observed that resentment grows in those who cannot express power outwardly, turning it inward where it corrodes the self. Stoicism warned against emotional slavery, but modern culture misinterpreted this as emotional suppression, confusing mastery with denial. True emotional mastery is not silence. It is strategic expression. It is controlled assertion. It is the ability to disrupt patterns before they crystallize into expectation. Because once expectation is formed, reversal becomes exponentially more painful. The first boundary is easy to draw. The 100th is nearly impossible. This is why the earliest moments of disrespect are the most dangerous. They are small enough to ignore, easy enough to excuse, subtle enough to rationalize. You tell yourself it's not worth the conflict. You tell yourself they didn't mean it. You tell yourself you're being sensitive. And in doing so, you override your instincts, the same instincts that evolved over thousands of years to detect threat, dominance, and imbalance. You silence the ancient radar within you, replacing it with social logic and emotional politeness. And the moment you do this, you step out of your natural position in the hierarchy of respect. You become a variable, an unknown quantity, someone whose limits are undefined, and undefined limits invite exploration. This is why people who never tolerate small disrespect are rarely disrespected in big ways. Their boundaries are visible. Their reactions are predictable. Their emotional territory is clearly marked. There is no mystery, no uncertainty, no invitation to test. But when you remain silent, you create ambiguity, and ambiguity is a playground for power seekers. They will step further. They will lean heavier. They will demand more, not necessarily because they are malicious, but because the system now allows it. And systems always operate to their maximum potential. Over time, this dynamic reshapes your relationships. Friends become demanding. Partners become dismissive. Colleagues become intrusive. Authority figures become overbearing. And in each case, the pattern is the same. Small violations, followed by silence, followed by escalation. You begin to feel used, drained, unseen. But because you have trained yourself to suppress reaction, you cannot express this without feeling guilt. You feel selfish for wanting space. You feel cruel for wanting boundaries. You feel disloyal for wanting autonomy. And so you continue absorbing until your emotional reserves are depleted. At this point, something dangerous occurs. Emotional shutdown. The mind, overwhelmed by unexpressed tension, retreats into detachment. You stop caring. You stop engaging. You stop connecting. You become distant, cold, and unreachable, not as a strategy, but as a survival mechanism. And ironically, this is when people finally notice a change, not because they care about your pain, but because your emotional withdrawal disrupts the benefits they were receiving. They label you distant. They call you changed. They accuse you of becoming selfish. But what they are really reacting to is the loss of access. the loss of emotional supply, the loss of control. And this reveals a deeper truth. Many relationships are maintained not by mutual respect, but by silent agreements of emotional exploitation. One gives, the other takes. One absorbs, the other releases. One endures, the other dominates. Silence maintains this balance. Expression threatens it. And so, from a young age, you are trained to remain silent, because silence stabilizes systems, even when those systems are unjust. Families rely on it. Workplaces depend on it. Institutions enforce it. Societies are built on it. The quiet ones keep everything running. They prevent chaos. They maintain order. They carry emotional load. And in return, they receive survival, acceptance, and invisibility. This trade-off becomes normal. You stop expecting respect. You start hoping for peace. You stop demanding fairness. You start tolerating imbalance. You shift from power to endurance. And endurance becomes your identity. But endurance is not strength. Endurance is adaptation to suffering. Strength is the ability to alter conditions. Silence cannot alter conditions. It can only survive them. This is why silence eventually becomes unbearable. Because deep inside, the human psyche is wired not just to survive, but to assert, to influence, to shape its environment. When this drive is suppressed long enough, it turns inward, manifesting as depression, anxiety, and self-doubt. You begin to question your worth. You begin to internalize mistreatment as deserved. You begin to see yourself through the eyes of those who disregard you. This is psychological colonization. Your internal narrative is hijacked by external disrespect. And once this happens, you no longer need enemies. You become your own oppressor. You silence yourself before anyone else has to. You minimize your needs before they can be rejected. You shrink your presence before it can be challenged. You disappear, slowly, politely, quietly. And this is the ultimate victory of domination, when the subject enforces their own subjugation. But there is a moment, usually born from accumulated exhaustion, when silence breaks internally, even if not externally. A moment when the mind begins to rebel, when resentment crystallizes into awareness, when you start to see patterns instead of isolated incidents. You realize that your suffering is not random. It is systematic. It is structural. It is predictable. And in this realization, a dangerous clarity emerges. You understand that your silence has not protected you. It has trained others how to treat you. This understanding is destabilizing, because it dismantles the comforting myth that patience leads to respect, that kindness earns loyalty, that endurance builds strength. You see that the world responds not to goodness, but to boundaries, not to empathy, but to consequence, not to silence, but to presence. This is not cynicism. This is realism. Power dynamics operate beneath moral narratives. They shape interactions long before values enter the equation. And once you become conscious of this layer, you begin to perceive reality differently. Conversations become negotiations. Politeness becomes strategy. Emotional exchanges become transactions. You see the invisible architecture of dominance and submission underlying every social interaction. And in this awareness, silence becomes impossible. Not because you suddenly become loud or aggressive, but because you understand that absence of response is itself a response. You recognize that every unchallenged behavior sets precedent. Every tolerated disrespect establishes pattern. Every swallowed emotion deepens conditioning. And so, The decision to remain silent becomes a strategic choice, not an emotional reflex. You choose when to withhold reaction, not out of fear, but out of calculation. You learn the difference between silence as power and silence as submission. Silence as power is deliberate, controlled, and unsettling. It creates uncertainty. It disrupts expectation. It signals independence. Silence as submission is predictable, habitual, and comforting to others. It stabilizes their dominance. It reassures them of control. It invites further intrusion. Most people operate in the second mode, believing they are calm when they are actually compliant. But the shift from compliance to control requires a radical internal transformation. It demands the dismantling of old identity structures built around being agreeable, accommodating, and harmless. It requires confronting the fear of conflict, the dread of rejection, the terror of standing alone. It requires accepting that respect often costs comfort, and autonomy often demands isolation. And this is the psychological threshold few are willing to cross. Because crossing it means losing the social rewards that silence provides: approval, safety, inclusion. You risk being labeled difficult, intense, arrogant, cold. You risk misunderstanding, judgment, and alienation. But what you gain is something far more dangerous: self-possession. The ability to occupy your own psychological space without apology. The authority to define your boundaries without explanation. The power to disrupt patterns that no longer serve you. And once you taste this, once you feel the internal alignment that comes from expressing truth instead of suppressing it, silence loses its appeal. You no longer crave peace at the cost of self. You no longer seek harmony built on imbalance. You begin to value tension as a sign of authenticity. You accept conflict as the price of clarity. And in this shift, the world reacts. Some will retreat. Some will resist. Some will attempt to reassert control. Some will vanish. Relationships will fracture. Dynamics will destabilize. Structures built on your compliance will collapse. And in the rubble, you will discover who respected you and who merely used you. This revelation is painful. It exposes illusions. It dismantles narratives. It reveals emotional debts you were never meant to pay. But it also liberates. It strips away the false bonds that kept you small. It clears space for relationships built on mutual recognition instead of silent exploitation. And yet, this liberation introduces a deeper challenge, because once silence is broken, once patterns are disrupted, once boundaries are asserted, you enter a psychological terrain where power, control, and emotional influence become explicit, no longer hidden beneath politeness. You step into a world where every interaction carries strategic weight, where emotional detachment becomes armor, where perception becomes weapon. And this transition is not gentle. It demands a new way of seeing, a new way of being, a new internal architecture capable of holding authority without arrogance, detachment without cruelty, and control without obsession. And it is here, at the edge of this transformation, that a far darker truth begins to emerge about emotional control, dominance, and the hidden mechanisms that govern human behavior, a truth that, once understood, will permanently alter the way you navigate every relationship, every environment, and every silent exchange. Most people believe emotional control is about staying calm, about not reacting, about appearing stable and composed. But this belief is a surface illusion, a soft narrative designed to keep them blind to the deeper mechanics of power, because true emotional control is not about peace, it is about dominance, and dominance is never gentle, never neutral, never passive. Emotional control is the ability to regulate not only your own internal state, but the emotional environment of others, to influence the psychological climate of any interaction without raising your voice, without forcing your will, without revealing your intent. It is the quiet art of steering perception, tension, and expectation. And the moment you begin to understand this, you realize that emotions are not merely feelings, they are signals, and whoever controls the signals controls the structure of reality itself. Human beings are not driven by logic. They are driven by emotional momentum, by unconscious impulses, by fear, desire, and social positioning. Every reaction, every hesitation, every shift in tone transmits information about status, threat, submission, and authority. Those who cannot regulate their emotions leak this information constantly. Their anxiety exposes vulnerability. Their anger reveals triggers. Their excitement displays dependency. Their sadness signals need. And in this exposure, they become readable, predictable, and therefore controllable. But the individual who masters emotional control becomes unreadable, and unreadability is power. When others cannot map your internal state, they cannot predict your behavior, and when they cannot predict your behavior, they cannot manipulate you. This is the foundation of psychological dominance. You are no longer a reactive organism responding to external stimuli. You become a stabilizing force, an emotional constant around which others must recalibrate. They adjust their tone to yours. They mirror your tempo. They seek your approval. They subconsciously defer to your presence. And all of this happens without a single overt display of authority, because the human nervous system is exquisitely sensitive to emotional regulation. We instinctively follow those who appear internally anchored, because stability implies safety, and safety implies leadership. But this leadership is not moral. It is biological. It predates civilization. In primitive environments, the calmest individual during chaos was the one most likely to survive, and so the species learned to align with emotional steadiness. Yet in modern society, this ancient instinct is exploited. Those who master emotional control can dominate social environments without force, without intimidation, without command. They become gravitational centers of attention and influence. People orbit them, drawn not by charisma, but by the unconscious recognition of power. And this power is subtle. It does not announce itself. It waits. It observes. It allows others to reveal themselves fully while revealing nothing in return. In any interaction, the one who speaks less and feels less holds more control, because they are not investing emotionally, and investment creates vulnerability. The more emotionally invested you are, the more leverage others possess. They can threaten your attachment, your approval, your belonging. But when you withdraw emotional investment, when you detach from outcome, you invert the dynamic. Suddenly, they are the ones seeking reaction. They are the ones craving validation. They are the ones adjusting behavior. This is why emotional detachment often feels cold to others. It destabilizes familiar power structures. It removes the emotional rewards they are accustomed to receiving. It forces them to confront uncertainty. And uncertainty is psychologically uncomfortable. Humans crave predictability. We want to know where we stand. We want feedback. We want reassurance. When someone denies us this, we experience a subtle loss of control, and we instinctively attempt to restore it through increased effort, attention, and compliance. This is how emotional control becomes dominance. Not by force, but by scarcity. Not by aggression, but by absence. The absence of reaction. The absence of emotional availability. The absence of predictable patterns. In this vacuum, others project, speculate, and adjust. They begin to work for your emotional response, even if they do not consciously realize it. They become performers in your psychological arena, while you remain the silent observer. This is not manipulation in the simplistic sense. It is a structural shift in emotional economics. You reduce supply. They increase demand. And where demand exceeds supply, power accumulates. This principle governs markets, politics, relationships, and warfare. Emotional control simply applies it at the level of human interaction. But this control is not natural. It must be cultivated through deliberate internal discipline, because the human nervous system is designed to react. We are wired for immediacy, for impulse, for emotional discharge. Suppressing this reflex requires training, and training requires suffering. The first stage of emotional control is awareness. You begin to notice the microsurges of feeling as they arise. The tightening in the chest, the heat behind the eyes, the shallow breath, the restless urge to respond. Most people act at this stage. They discharge the emotion immediately, speaking, reacting, defending, explaining. But control begins when you pause, when you sit inside the discomfort without expression, when you allow the emotion to peak and fall without externalization. This creates a separation between stimulus and response. In that separation, choice is born, and choice is the root of power. Each time you choose not to react, you strengthen the neural pathways associated with restraint. You train your nervous system to tolerate tension. You become comfortable with internal pressure, and this comfort changes you. You begin to move slower. You speak less. You observe more. You no longer feel compelled to fill silence. You no longer fear awkwardness. You no longer chase resolution. You allow situations to remain unresolved, ambiguous, suspended. This creates psychological gravity. They are seeking sensation. They are seeking proof of existence. Emotional pain feels more real than emotional neutrality, and so they manufacture chaos to feel alive. But you no longer need chaos. You no longer need intensity. You no longer need validation. And this sets you apart in a world addicted to stimulation. You become still in a storm. You become quiet in noise. You become slow in urgency. And this slowness, this stillness, this quiet, terrifies and attracts in equal measure. Some will resent you. Some will envy you. Some will try to provoke you, to break your composure, to reclaim their sense of superiority. They will test your triggers. They will push boundaries. They will attempt to extract reaction. And each time you refuse, each time you remain composed, their internal tension increases. They feel exposed. They feel powerless. They feel small. And in that feeling, their true nature emerges. Some become aggressive. Some become submissive. Some withdraw. Some obsess. And through these reactions, you learn more about human psychology than any book could teach. You witness the raw mechanisms of dominance and submission playing out in real time. You see how fragile egos are. You see how desperate people are for emotional control. You see how easily they surrender autonomy for comfort. And this knowledge changes you. It hardens you. It sharpens you. It isolates you. But it also empowers you. You become untouchable in ways most cannot comprehend. You can walk into hostile environments and remain unaffected. You can face criticism without collapse. You can endure rejection without desperation. You can navigate conflict without escalation. And in this resilience, you find a strange freedom. You are no longer hostage to mood, to opinion, to circumstance. You exist above the emotional weather of the world. But this elevation creates a new vulnerability, detachment from meaning. When emotions are regulated, life can begin to feel flat. The highs are muted, the lows are contained. Experience becomes even, predictable, controlled, and in this control, a subtle emptiness can arise. You may begin to miss intensity. You may crave danger. You may seek extremes to feel something. This is the paradox of emotional mastery. As you gain control, you risk losing vitality. And so the final stage of emotional control is integration, not suppression. It is the ability to access emotion without being enslaved by it, to feel deeply without losing clarity, to experience intensity without surrendering control, to engage fully without attachment. This balance is rare. It requires continuous self-observation, continuous recalibration, and few reach it. Most either drown in emotion or dry up in detachment. But those who find this balance become something else entirely. They become forces. They move through reality with presence, gravity, and restraint. Their words carry weight. Their silence carries meaning. Their attention feels valuable. Their absence feels noticeable. They do not dominate through fear. They dominate through coherence. Their internal world is so ordered, so aligned, so controlled, that it reshapes the external world around them. And yet, even at this stage, a deeper truth waits beneath the surface, a truth about boundaries, unpredictability, and the psychological architecture of respect, a truth that will dismantle your remaining assumptions about how power is enforced, how status is maintained, and how identity is ultimately protected, a truth that, once understood, will force you to confront the final transformation.